On February 24, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. The world is in shock, because who would have expected a war on the European continent in this century? A few weeks earlier, Russia had said for a last time to leave Ukraine neutral. NATO membership would not be tolerated. There was no response, or it was an arrogant response from Washington. This is something Ukraine decides itself. Russia has nothing to do with it, said Antony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, in January 2022. Or NATO's response.
And I was actually present at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008 when all allies agreed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And we stand by that decision and decisions taken after the Bucharest summit on the issue of Ukraine's possibility to become a NATO member.
In this regard, we have made it absolutely clear that NATO's expansion to the east is unacceptable. What's not clear about it? We are not the ones that deploy missiles next to the United States borders. That's the other way around. The United States brought their missiles next to our borders. They are at our threshold. Are we excessive in our demands not to put any more offensive weapons next to our home? What's so unusual about this request? So NATO is expanding, and so now they're in Poland, so they have the offensive weapons in there. That's what I'm talking about. We are not the ones who are threatening someone. We are not the ones who came to the border of the US or the UK. They came to us. And now they're saying, no, now we will have Ukraine as well. It means they will deploy their weapons there. Or then you start to expand NATO to the east. But we ask you not to do it, and you promised us that you won't do it. And then you told, show us the paper where it says, we don't care about your concerns. And that happened every year. Every year.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine was widely condemned, and the entire history was ignored. Former Hamburg mayor Klaus von Dohnanyi put it this way: the fact that Russia started this war is a crime. The fact that the West did not prevent it is a sin. What is the big plan behind this tragic East-West conflict? Why didn't we leave Ukraine neutral? It was presented to Westerners as a war between Ukraine and Russia. In reality, it is a war between Russia and the United States, or NATO. The United States strives for world hegemony at any price. This strategy, in a disguised form, has been going on for 30 years. The Western public was taught to feel phobic about Russia. NATO expanded its presence in the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and many other countries. Ukrainian President Zelensky, who succeeded Poroshenko in 2019, travels the Western world after the Russian invasion of his country. He asked for arms supplies in many countries and was welcomed in all Western countries like a pop star, with loud cheers, applause and all the respect. Meanwhile, the fighting on the battlefield was beginning to take on barbaric proportions. After 5 weeks of fighting between Ukrainians and Russians, there was a real chance of a peace treaty in Istanbul. Russia would withdraw from Ukraine, and Zelensky promised that Ukraine would agree to neutrality, so no more ambitions for a NATO membership. But back in Kyiv, Boris Johnson was waiting for him with the message that Ukraine had to fight on and should not agree to this peace treaty. Washington and NATO had decided that the fighting had to continue.
5 weeks after the start of the conflict, there could have been a peace agreement reached between Ukrainian and Russian people in Istanbul. What's your explanation of this?
I think in March 2022 there were talks in Istanbul between delegations of Russia and Ukraine, and the peace agreement was almost ready. I would not say that it was finalized, but some basic elements were agreed and even initialed. And that was the neutral and non-aligned status of Ukraine and international...
You mean NATO?
Non-NATO, yes, non-NATO for Ukraine, yeah.
Okay.
And at the same time, international guarantees for Ukrainian safety. And Russia was was ready not only to accept it, but also to join this system of guarantees. But then, we showed demonstrated goodwill, because Western countries somehow said that it would be good if Russia withdraws its troops from the northern part of Ukraine, from Kiev, from Kharkiv region, just to create a kind of feasible climate for the negotiations, and we did it. And then abruptly, the Ukrainian side stopped all the talks and left Istanbul, and it came out later that was on the order of the British Prime Minister, Mr. Boris Johnson, who said, no, you should not negotiate, you should fight again just until the last Ukrainian is alive.
Zelensky's closest advisor and confidant, David Arakhamia, speaks openly about this.
Дивіться, Путін же ж показував документ, за результатом білоруських перемовин, африканській делегації він це демонстрував, де, як він стверджує, прописаний проєкт мирної угоди з Україною. І на цей документ начебто було парафійовано в Стамбулі. Називався цей документ «Угода про постійний нейтралітет України і гарантії безпеки». Путін казав, що там було 18 статей.
Мета російської делегації була, на мій погляд, показати, вони дійсно майже до останнього сподівалися, що вони нас дотиснуть на підписання такої угоди. Щоб ми взяли нейтралітет. Це було найбільше для них справа, щоб вони готові були закінчити війну, якщо ми візьмемо, як Фінляндія колись там, нейтралітет і дамо зобов'язання, що ми не будемо вступати до НАТО.
Тільки один пункт.
Ну, фактично, ключовий пункт був цей. Все інше там косметичні політичні приправки, типу про денацифікацію, російськомовне населення і бла-бла-бла.
Чому Україна не погодилася на цей пункт?
Ну, по-перше, для того, щоб на цей пункт погодитись, треба змінювати Конституцію. Наш шлях до НАТО записаний в Конституції. По-друге, немає довіри, і не було, і немає росіян, що вони це зроблять. Це можна було тільки зробити, якщо є гарантії безпеки. Ну, ми ж не могли щось підписати, відійти, всі б там видихнули, а потім вони б зайшли більш підготовлені, бо вони зайшли насправді не підготовлені до такого супротиву. Тому ми могли тільки працювати, коли є 100% впевненість, що це не повториться вдруге. А такої впевненості немає. Більш того, коли ми повернулися з Стамбулу, приїхав Борис Джонсон до Києва і сказав, що ми взагалі не будемо з ними нічого підписувати, і давайте будемо просто воювати.
Shortly after this interview, Ukrainska Pravda, one of Ukraine's leading newspapers, reported about this interview and that Russia's demand for peace was neutrality. To learn more about the subject, we visit the Dutch political scientist and expert in international relations, Professor Kees van der Pijl, and the American geopolitics and Russia expert in Brussels, Professor Gilbert Doctorow.
Why is that the Ukraine had to continue to fight against Russia when a peace agreement in Istanbul was within reach?
Well, very soon after the start of the special military operation, the spokesman for the United States, and in particular the Secretary of Defense, Paul Austin, said openly that the United States hoped to impose a defeat on Russia of such magnitude that it would not be in a position to threaten its neighbors for decades. That's a nice way of saying that it wanted to destroy Russian armed forces and, if possible, also destroy the Russian economy. It was inconvenient for the United States that 5 weeks into this operation, the war would end. And so, with using the help of Boris Johnson as its emissary, the United States cancelled the agreements which Kiev had initialed with their Russian counterparts in Istanbul. And this is not a matter of speculation. It's an issue that has become part of the public space over the last 6 months, when various witnesses and participants to those negotiations have spoken out about the destruction of the almost concluded agreement by Johnson in acting in consort with the United States.
So 5 weeks after the beginning of the conflict.
Yes, 500,000 Ukrainian lives could have been spared, and they weren't. The war is still ongoing, and clearly the United States is interested in extending it, and preventing anything resembling a Ukrainian defeat. There are many people like myself who have, over the course of the last 2 years, been caught out, who have predicted that a Russian victory is just around the corner, and then have found ourselves looking rather foolish because nothing of the sort happened. But the reason for that is that the United States, at each time that the Russians were coming closer to a victory, upped the ante, increased the level of destructive power that was handed over to the Ukrainians, or was being operated by allied forces not in uniform, acting as mercenaries, but in effect actually carrying out the orders of France, of Poland, of the United States on Ukrainian territory to man and to guide sophisticated weapon systems like Patriot that the Ukrainians themselves were in no position to operate.
The big continent of Eurasia. Europe and Russia are both located on this Eurasian continent. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe and Russia believed in cooperation. Together they could achieve a lot. Europe has the free market, technological knowledge and knowledge of public administration. And Russia has almost all conceivable raw materials and minerals, a highly educated population, and a pro-European attitude. As Gorbachev spoke about Russia within the European house, and as Putin long believed in the connection from Vladivostok to Lisbon. Also the US belonged here, Europeans and Russians thought, until 2014. After the Cold War, America was the only superpower left. The consensus about the American ruling class in Washington was that this should remain the case. This consensus is supported by both leading political parties. In other words, it doesn't matter whether the American president is a Republican or a Democrat, the pursuit of global hegemony remains the same. In secret, the American elite had been working on a strategy since 1991 that would ensure that the US would remain the leading power on the Eurasian continent. This is the so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine. Paul Wolfowitz, an American politician, wrote a document together with Dick Cheney that assumes that America is the only remaining superpower, and that this must remain so. No state should have the capacity to work its way up to being a competitor of American power. Russia is specifically seen as a possible threat. This Wolfowitz doctrine also describes the expansion of American influence in the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine. A forerunner of Wolfowitz in the camp of America as an independent unipolar power is Zbigniew Brzezinski. He is also American with Polish ancestors. His geopolitical ideas are completely consistent with NATO's expansion to the east. He assumes that the West, which is actually America, must control the Eurasian continent. These countries must come under the control of Washington, or be so weak that they cannot offer resistance to American power. Ukraine, in particular, must be seen as a region of importance. Brzezinski even literally stated that Russia could not be a great power without Ukraine. Kyiv is therefore of crucial importance to the US in order to expand its influence and to keep Russia as a weak regional power. In 1979, Brzezinski wrote, "The geopolitical main prize of America is Eurasia. Eurasia is the chessboard on which the battle for global hegemony will be fought in the future." The Brzezinski and Wolfowitz doctrines have had a significant impact on Western politics to this day. They have positioned the West, including NATO, directly against Russia.
Ja, je noemde ook Wolfowitz en dat is nog wel belangrijk dat hij in 1991, dus direct na het instorten van de Sovjet-Unie, heeft hij iemand een rapport laten schrijven dat heette de Defense Planning Guidance voor 1992 tot 1994, als ik me niet vergis. En daarin staat, dat is pas veel later is dat openbaar gemaakt, maar de New York Times die heeft daar delen uit gepubliceerd. En daarin staan eigenlijk twee dingen, namelijk nooit meer toestaan dat er een macht komt die zo sterk is dat Amerika gedwongen is er tot een vergelijk mee te komen. Ik noemde dat al eerder. Maar het tweede is ook heel belangrijk, dat Europa niet moet denken dat zij nu ook een rol in de wereld kunnen gaan spelen. Zij moeten begrijpen dat ze een regionale macht zijn die zich moet voegen naar de politieke belangen van de VS. Dat is de Wolfowitz-doctrine die wel algemeen zo wordt aangeduid.
Already at the beginning of the 20th century, long before the time of Wolfowitz and Brzezinski, there was another scientist who predicted that the power of the world would lie in the Eurasian continent. It was the British geographer and politician Halford John Mackinder. Mackinder said, "Whoever controls the heartland controls the world." This also explains why American policy towards Ukraine was aimed at pulling Ukraine out of the Russian sphere of influence, because Ukraine is located in the middle of the Eurasian continent. Due to the strong rise of technology around 1900, and especially the railway, this Brit foresaw the decline of the power of the countries that controlled the seas, of which England was by far the most important one. The biggest threat was posed by the largest contiguous continent, Eurasia. The core of this lies in the heart of this continent, which he called Heartland. Transport over land was much easier, more effective and faster. Moreover, everything was present on this continent, both in terms of food supply and for industrial development. For the world powers of that time that did not belong to this heartland, the US and England, this felt like a great threat. So it was very important to them to prevent harmony on the Eurasian continent and to ensure disharmony there at all times. Otherwise, they would be sidelined. In particular, the relationship with the most prominent present in Eurasia, Russia, had to and must be consistently disrupted.
De Mackinder-doctrine die heeft ertoe bijgedragen om telkens krachten te steunen die de Eurasiatische eenheid met geweld zouden verbreken. Conflictstof die maakt dat met name West-Europa, continentaal West-Europa en Rusland, in mindere mate China, wat natuurlijk toen nog niet zo belangrijk was, altijd tegen elkaar komen te staan. Vanuit de betroffen landen, dus West-Europa en Rusland, is juist altijd de aandrang geweest om de meest logische weg te volgen. En dat is elkaars comparatieve voordelen als het ware te benutten. Russische grondstoffen en fundamentele wetenschap in combinatie met Duitse, Franse, Italiaanse industrieel talent en kwaliteitsarbeid. De goedkope grondstoffen uit Rusland zijn tot aan het bombarderen van de Nord Stream pijpleiding onlangs natuurlijk altijd een drager geweest van de welvaart in Europa.
In this great geopolitical power game, it is crucial to see that Washington would prefer to keep all of Europe under its umbrella. A union of Europe and Russia on the Eurasian continent, independent of Washington, has to be prevented at all costs. NATO expansion plays a major role in this. As early as the 1950s, there was a NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay Hastings, who said that the function of NATO was keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out, and keep the Germans down. In 1991, after the reunification of East and West Germany, it was Germany in particular that began to develop good relations with Russia. Economically, politically, and socially, Germany was the European country that saw the advantages of the line from Vladivostok to Lisbon. Germany gave Russia the knowledge for a market economy, and Russia provided Germany and Europe with a cheap and reliable gas supply. Together, they built the Nord Stream gas pipelines on the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Already in 2014, this gas pipeline between Germany and Russia was seen as a threat to Washington. The pipeline was blown up in 2022. 2 weeks before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a joint press conference by the US and Germany.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Possibly this is a good idea to say to our American friends. We will be united, we will act together, and we will take all the necessary steps, and all the necessary steps will be done by all of us together.
Today, will you commit today to turning off and pulling the plug on Nord Stream 2? You didn't mention it, you haven't mentioned it.
As I already said, we are acting together. We are absolutely united, and we will not taking different steps. We will do the same steps, and they will be very, very hard to Russia, and they should understand.
In September 2024, the news said that Ukraine itself was behind the blowing up of the pipeline. Critical analysts, based on the history and initiation of the attack, dispute this.
Why were the American policymakers doing so much to undermine the relation between Russia and Germany?
Well, this goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s, and it was magnified after the reunification in 1989. The Americans were afraid that Germany would cut free from the rest of the European economic community and from NATO, and would seek an accommodation with Russia at the expense of American domination of Europe. This was why in the 1980s the United States led a very aggressive campaign to stop the whole policy of Entspannung, of détente, that was introduced by Willy Brandt under the advice of his counselor Egon Bahr, and which sought to establish economic ties for the sake of improved political ties and for the sake of a more Western-like Russia. That policy was held in suspicion by the United States. They did what they could to sabotage the economic cooperation by opposing the pipeline deals that eventually brought supplies of Russian natural gas to Germany and to Europe, using pipes that were then fabricated in Germany because they alone had the manufacturing capability for these very large diameter gas pipes. And the pipes were exchanged for deliveries of the product, natural gas. This was all opposed by the United States. And then in 1989, as I say, there was the reunification, and not only the States, but even France was wondering which way will the new Germany turn. Now it has a substantial part of the former communist East Central Europe. The DDR became part of a unified Federal Republic, and they were fearful that it would turn its eyes eastward and no longer be a supporter of NATO. So this fear of German-Russian accommodation had a long history before it played out in this new millennium, and the United States succeeded ultimately in sabotaging the economic cooperation, the energy cooperation between Germany and Russia, and the political cooperation, such as it was when there was still in 2012 a long-term cooperation treaty between Russia and Germany that was allowed to lapse and was never replaced.
Where has this Western geopolitics led to? Russia was driven into the arms of China by this American geopolitics. The wish of Gorbachev and Putin to get Russia into the European house did not come to fruition and was opposed by the US. The future of the Eurasian continent is now up to Russia, China, India, and other emerging Asian countries. In 2015, China started the One Road, One Belt initiative, and together with Russia, colossal economic projects are being realized. The two countries also took the initiative in forming the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a group of self-confident countries with fast-growing economies that want to work together. Together, they strive for a new, multipolar world that is not ruled by the US alone. In October 2024, the annual meeting of the BRICS member states took place in Kazan, Russia, an event that was being closely watched by the Western world because the power of the BRICS is growing rapidly. According to economists, the BRICS will have an economy as big as the Western countries in 2040 and will only continue to grow after that. This will definitely have an impact on the power balance in the world on an economic level and from a geopolitical perspective. The US in particular is desperately seeking for ways to stop the rise of the BRICS. Europe also seems to be missing the boat now that they can no longer use their unique geographical location to an advantage due to the bad relationship with Russia.
After centuries of living together, Ukraine and Russia became independent for the first time in 1991. Both Slavic countries had great problems governing their countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The new capitalist model that was introduced after communism quickly degenerated into predatory capitalism. The basic social provisions of communism were gone, and the free market was introduced. To make this complicated transition from communism to capitalism, a shock therapy was advised by the West. Oligarchs would become in a few years' time the richest people in the country, but at the same time the common people became increasingly poor. The economic, political and legal infrastructure was lacking, and social services became barely functioning. Street children were everywhere, and people could be thrown out of their homes by unscrupulous, criminal real estate men. Hunger, cold and poverty came, and there was a frightening amount of crime and mafia. Old party bosses, smart guys, or foreign investors plundered state property and the corruption was horrific.
We hebben in het westerse wereld eigenlijk nauwelijks begrepen hoe moeilijk het was voor de mensen die in de Sovjet-Unie waren opgegroeid. En dat jullie naar de jaren 90 gingen. En wij dachten dat jullie vrij zouden zijn en democratie. Maar we hebben eigenlijk nooit begrepen dat het voor jullie heel moeilijk was.
Ik woonde in die tijd, je beseft het niet. Hè? Dus dat is pas achteraf in retrospectief, zoals nu kan ik kijken, hoe overleef ik dat eigenlijk?
Toen Oekraïne onafhankelijk werd in 1991, ging het helemaal mis. Helemaal lege schappen in de winkel, bijna niks te koop. 's Ochtends moest ik heel vroeg voor mijn werk nog ergens 3 liter melk gaan halen om zelf kwark te maken. Die prijzen gingen omhoog. Alle spaargeld door de inflatie is helemaal verdampt. En als ik in de jaren 80 had salaris van 160 roebels en dat ging eigenlijk goed met normale leven, geen luxe, maar toch normaal. En dan in 1994 had ik salaris van 7 miljoen Oekraïense coupons. Maar ik stond in de winkel, op straat. En ik dacht, ga ik 2 sinaasappelen voor mijn dochter kopen of toch niet? Zo was het. Dat was zielig, ja, vooral oude ometjes die zitten ergens op de trappen bij metro-ingang om te bedelen. Veel kinderen zijn verwaarloosd, ja.
Ja, dat was eigenlijk niks meer. Nauwelijks meer. Er was haast niks meer in de winkels. En als het open was, dan waren de rijen die een van mijn ouders in de avond daarvoor in de rij mochten staan, een geluk hebben dat tot zij aan de beurt zijn, toch nog even een brood konden krijgen. Ook de stroom die regelmatig uitviel. En kregen we stroom dus ongeveer 2 uur per dag. En dan was nog altijd afwachten of die aanging. Dat was altijd nog een verrassing of die aanging. Voor drinken kwam geen water meer uit de kraan. Nou, dan gingen we met kruiwagen naar de waterbron 3 kilometer verderop.
Op de markt boeken verkopen en trouwringen verkopen, dus dat is zo zielig.
Er ontstond heel veel armoede. Want ja, wij kregen allemaal zo'n bonnetjes van ja, je kon of een stukje zeep kopen of een kilootje suiker.
Maar ik weet dat veel mensen hun huis hadden uiteindelijk verkocht. Het was klaar. Het was geen politie, het was geen school, het was geen perspectief, het was niks. Het was in ieder geval voor ons een drama.
En mijn vader werd ziek, kanker. En de diagnostiek, dus ziekenhuis, opeens ziekenhuis, kijk naar jou, nou wat verwacht je van mij? Zoiets, kijk om je heen, overal is kapot, verwacht je van mij dat ik doe zoals vroeger of zo. Dus dan weet je niet waar je moet beginnen eigenlijk. Dan geeft hij recept, 1 apotheek zegt nee, je bent niet meer, andere je bent niet meer.
Ik kan me herinneren, de polykliniek was dicht. Was dicht, de wind waaide overal. Er waren geen spullen in de kamers, onderzoeksspullen, er waren helemaal niks.
People in the West were not aware of this extreme chaos in Russia and Ukraine. We were mainly focused on the fact that the evil communist era was over. That instead of democracy, total lawlessness and chaos had arisen, Western people hardly realized.
Yes, vrijheid. Wat? Wij gaan net als Amerika vrij, Europa vrij, wij ook vrij. Vrijheid, dus dan die woord vrijheid is nog een beetje nieuw in je woordenschat. Dan herhaal je hem en het lijkt alsof hoe meer hem herhaalt, hoe meer vrijheid wordt. Maar dat werkte niet zo. Maar uiteindelijk zie ik vrijheid was voor onbeleefdheid, voor amorele dingen. En dat doen gewoon normaal, dat is heel normaal. Dus vroeger was je verlegen van iets, omdat dat jouw innerlijke gevoel zegt dat is niet goed. En dus opeens, dat is wel goed, dat doet iedereen. En dan, oké, dan pas je alweer aan, snap je? Dus dat zijn wel opeens.
Wij dachten dat jullie dan tenminste nu vrij waren in democratie.
Wij weten niet wat democratie is. Wij wisten niet wat democratie is. Het was niet democratie, het was criminaliteit. Sterker nog, de helft van de bevolking nu nog steeds bang is voor de democratie. Ja, de helft van de bevolking is nu nog steeds bang voor de democratie en alles wat met zich meebrengt. Die willen graag veiligheid.
Ja. Met dat er tenminste weer een politie functioneert.
Overal, tot aan de voordeur. Veiligheid.
Ja.
Wij moesten vroeger gewoon barter wordt het genoemd. Barter. Dus je krijgt iets in de plaats van geld, want de directeur kijkt zo, wij hebben geen geld. Waarom? Dan, ja, je kan wel dit hele rare vraag, waarom kan ze niet uitleggen waarom? Omdat het democratie is misschien. Dus de woorden, de mooie woorden van democratie, vrijheid, liefde, doen voor elkaar. Ze hebben eigen juiste essentie kwijt. En ze worden gewoon misbruikt, dat voel ik wel hier.
Ja. Wij dachten in het Westen juist dat jullie juist democratie hadden en vrijheid.
In één keer, hè? Dat kan toch niet in één keer?
We denken altijd voor en na. Voor hadden we allemaal een normale leven. We dachten niet over vrijheid of democratie. We hadden een normale leven. Ik had baan, een appartement. Ik was gescheiden toen. En ik woonde met mijn dochter. En eigenlijk, ja, zo'n beetje middenklasse. In de zomer met vakantie. Af en toe wat, ja, iets kopen. Ja, met vriendinnen uit. En ja, vrij normale leven voor die uiteenval van de Sovjet-Unie.
Angstige ouders zag ik. Angstige ouders die verantwoordelijkheden hadden om voor hun kinderen te zorgen.
Ja, en de slag voor onze ouders, de generatie van mijn ouders, was heel groot. Heel veel, dus mensen van mijn leeftijd, van mijn moeder en vader, dus gewoon sterven van inflatie. Geld was opeens zo'n 100 keer inflatie.
Russians and Ukrainians are brotherly nations. For centuries we lived together and no one cared about whether someone is Russian or someone is Ukrainian, just people live together. After the demise of the Soviet Union, at least for the first decades of the independent existence of Ukraine, it lived on the expense of Russia. It survived only due to huge financial, economic, material support from Russia. The majority of the Ukrainians, they still, I'm sure, they still feel themselves as brothers, sisters.
That Ukrainians and Russians could also have been happy in the Soviet Union, Westerners could not understand at all. Years ago, Putin said,
"Those who want the Soviet Union back have no brains. Those who do not miss the Soviet Union have no heart."
Want jullie waren altijd goed, Oekraïners.
Ja, dat was heel bij elkaar. Ja.
Ja.
Ik had nooit kunnen geloven dat het zo kan.
Nee.
En toen de grenzen opeens ontstonden, toen een ander geld kwam. En mijn grootouders, die komen oorspronkelijk uit het noorden van Rusland, die gingen in Oekraïne gewoon simpel wonen. Ja, omdat het gewoon wat warmer was en mijn opa wilde daar werken en ja, dat. En mijn tante is ook daar naartoe al verhuisd. Maar ja, opeens zaten wij in 2 verschillende landen.
Het was 1 land en dan opeens ben je in het buitenland. Iedereen was 1 nationaliteit en opeens weer iedereen vreemd voor elkaar. Dus dat was een shock.
Een van de voorbeelden die wij in het Westen niet zo goed begrijpen, en ook dat is dat alles was voor de tijd van de staat, communisme. En dan na het communisme wordt ineens alles vrijgegeven. Dat er ineens geprivatiseerd moest worden. Hoe gaat dat dan? De werknemers stonden op straat en die kregen papiertjes in de hand en dat waren vouchers. Ja, konden die dan een aandeel kopen in de fabriek?
Iedereen op zijn werk kreeg zo'n papiertje. Ze kregen haar deeltje, ik weet niet, ergens in.
We hebben inderdaad ook allemaal die vouchers gekregen. En je krijgt voucher van het bedrijf. En over een jaar bestaat het bedrijf niet meer. Dus nou, dat is niks waard.
Maar degene die daar wel niet voor geleerd, dus mijn moeder wist niet dat het kan handelen, verkopen, kopen, omkopen.
Ik denk dat ik mijn voucher niet eens heb verkocht. Dat lag misschien ergens in de boekenkast. Ja. Want ja, ik begreep de waarde daarvan absoluut niet. Want ja, nooit opgeleid. Nooit opleidingen gekregen in economie en dat je dan eigendommen mag hebben, moet hebben. Het is wonder boven wonder dat wij nog huizen mochten houden. Het enige wat ik mij kan herinneren, ik was een jaar of 18, 19 denk ik. Toen, wij zaten bij mijn opa het huis en toen kwamen dus zijn vrouw, zijn zus met die papiertjes en daar werd gesproken van nou wat gaan we daarmee doen? Nou ja, dat stelt niks voor, ja die en die wil het kopen, verkopen, nou doe het maar. Dus daar kwamen een heel lang, misschien 10 mannetjes, die heel handig al die papiertjes dan verzamelen van iedereen. En nou, opeens, hop, een fabriek was van hun. Opportunistisch ingestelde mensen, want die gingen gewoon kansen grijpen. En dan maakten ze riskeerden niks eigenlijk. Het kostte heel weinig geld. En mensen met geld, dat waren de criminelen die tijd. Maar normaal iemand gaat nooit meer dan 2.000, 3.000 roebel op de bankrekening staan. Ja, dus wie had... Nou, op dat moment toen bijvoorbeeld 20.000, 30.000 roebel. Nou ja, criminelen.
Natuurlijk enorm beangstigend. En wie die macht over had, dat maakte ook wel beangstigend, is dat een soort maffia. En nou woonde ik in een klein stadje, dus echt grote maffia hadden we niet. Maar natuurlijk waren altijd van die jongeren van die jonge mannen.
Jongeren die vroeger waren zeg maar ergens niet te zien, niet op beeld, maar nu komt die criminaliteit zo volop lopen, alsof dat in hun handen nu de macht is.
En die namen de leiding over. Die namen de leiding over de bevolking, die namen de leiding over degene die probeerden iets te ondernemen, hun voedingswaarde te verkopen of te ruilen. Die namen de leiding over alles. Dus ja, dat was zeker beangstigend. Ik wou niet opvallen hoor. Nee.
En kon je dan niet makkelijk naar een politie gaan? Functioneerde die niet meer?
Nee.
Nee?
Nee, die was er niet. En als hij er was, dan moest ik wat voor betalen. Maar hij betaalde meer, dus dat gaf geen zin.
Dus zelfs het hele veiligheidsapparaat was in elkaar gestort en functioneerde niet meer?
Nee.
Ja, dus geen politie op straat die jou kon helpen als je door deze criminele jongetjes werd...
Nee.
Die was uit elkaar gevallen.
Dus de gemeente functioneerde ook niet meer?
De problemen waren te veel, dus zij konden niet gewoon... als er te veel problemen waren en te veel corruptie.
Ja.
After 15 years of hyperinflation and chaos, Russia managed to get the country back on track from 2005 onwards. Stability, order and security slowly returned, and the state played a strong role again. Putin's government ensured reducing the power of the oligarchs, proper facilities, institutions and organizations for a necessary economic middle class, a stability fund from which money was paid for new schools, hospitals, restoration of cities, wages and pensions, and agriculture and defense were put back on track. Russians themselves were especially proud that the national debts had been practically completely paid off. Ukraine, on the other hand, had hardly gained any stability because the oligarchs kept power and determined politics. The Ukrainian state hardly fulfilled its duties and corruption kept on growing. One president chose a pro-European line and another president chose a pro-Russian line. The common people were disappointed with each new president. In addition, the newly independent Ukraine was very divided. The large minority were Russians, but many other nationalities, such as Hungarians, Romanians, Belarusians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and many others had lived there for centuries. Due to the growing inequality, nationalism increased. The power of the oligarchs remained unlimited, and corruption took on alarming proportions. Despondency, powerlessness, frustration and mismanagement made Ukrainians susceptible to a revolution. The call for Western help in 2013 is understandable. The word democracy seemed like paradise, only it was not yet clear to them then that this help from outside also had its own interests.
People of Ukraine, this is your moment. This is about the future you deserve. The free world is with you. America is with you. I am with you.
What is the background? During the time of President George Bush Jr., neoconservatives became more convinced that the world domination of the US had to be continued. His Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, was due to his contact with the military-industrial complex a proponent of the NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. The third important person is Paul Wolfowitz. Wolfowitz wrote a doctrine that is known in this period as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. A milder name is the Project for the New American Century. This doctrine means, in short, that America has the unilateral right, meaning the sole right, to maintain world domination, and that every rising power, so Russia, must be kept small and, if necessary, must be eliminated. Dick Cheney is also a notable figure in this administration because he was behind the regime change in Iraq. In the West, we often associate the concept of regime change or government transition primarily with the Arab world, where dictators are to be removed. A surprised General Wesley Clark, who led the Second Gulf War in Iraq, spoke in 2007 about Washington's mindset and approach.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me."
I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. What you will see is an accumulation of facts. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein has used such weapons. And Saddam Hussein has no compunction about using them again against his neighbors and against his own people. But how much longer Are we willing to put up with Iraq's non-compliance before we, as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough, enough?
The idea that a deliberate regime change could also occur in Europe is almost unthinkable for Western people, and perhaps even more so for Europeans. The strategy behind it, therefore, had to be implemented with a bit more finesse to ensure its legitimacy. Dick Cheney wrote, together with Paul Wolfowitz, the doctrine that is aimed at maintaining world domination. The fifth person who plays an important role in this Bush administration is Karl Rove. With this man, think of the power of the media. Karl Rove is the one who said, "We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. So, we create reality." The power that the media has developed in recent years to continuously display Russia negatively into the news can be traced back to this. No matter how hard Russia tried to build a good relation with the West, it was all in vain. The strategy had already been determined. Russia had to and must constantly be portrayed as the aggressor. More than 25 years of anti-Russia propaganda embedded itself in our minds. Western people were misled.
That if the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or TikTok, whatever they are, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control. And it's not just the social and psychological effects, it's real harm.
Ik was begin 2006 aanwezig in de Dasha van Vladimir Poetin. Ik was daar als medewerker. Ik was weggestopt achterin het zaaltje waar het plaatsvond.
Meanwhile, NATO's expansion eastward continued, despite the promise the West had made to Russia not to expand. The Western belief that these countries had the right to determine their own security was a fact. However, there were also the backyard politics of incorporating these new countries into NATO. The initial plans for NATO expansion in 1997 caused much confusion in Russia, and the discussion about keeping one's word began to spark disappointment and suspicion among Russians at that time. During discussions about the possible reunification of Germany and subsequently the continuation of Germany's NATO membership, agreements had already been made that NATO would not expand 1 inch further eastward afterward.
President Gorbachev asked me to help his economic team. President Yeltsin asked me to help his economic team. President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine, asked me to help his economic team. So I've watched this close up. Look, it was very straightforward. Gorbachev was a man of peace. He said that the Soviet Union will end the Warsaw Pact military alliance, and the U.S. and Germany were very explicit. This is James Baker, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany. We will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. Of course, it was a lie.
However, at that time, Russia was severely weakened, and the Yeltsin administration had no other choice but to accept this expansion. The feeling of suspect grew within the Russian population. They said that they were forced to direct themselves towards the east and especially China. An arrogant Joe Biden, already in 1997, speaks about this NATO expansion.
I had one interesting conversation with Zhuganov, which was repeated with Levitt. They talked about they don't want this NATO expansion. They know it's not in their security interests and on and on. And said, well, and if you do that, we may have to look to China. And I couldn't help using the colloquial expression from my state by saying to Zhuganov, lots of luck in your senior year. Good luck. And if that doesn't work, try Iran. I'm serious.
The United States immediately within even Bush 1 was calculating, okay, how do we expand NATO? We won, they lost, we expand. Promises, commitments don't mean anything. And already our diplomats said, this is a terrible idea. Don't break the peace with Russia. Bill Perry at the time said, don't do this. And he thought about resigning. But you know Clinton, he didn't think very hard about it. The security state said, just move right on in. NATO expansion started. We know from Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 that the game plan was already clear, the timeline, to go all the way to Ukraine and further to Georgia. And if you look at a map, Georgia ain't a North Atlantic country.
In 1999, the first 3 countries were added to NATO: Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. In 2004, 7 more countries were admitted to NATO: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Russia was shocked, and the emerging President Putin faced mounting pressure from growing nationalists to be less naive. At that time, President Putin was oriented toward the West, and he had just expressed to George W. Bush that Russia would collaborate with the US in the fight against terrorism. Putin had also given his famous speech in German in Berlin, emphasizing that Europe and Russia belong together, from Vladivostok to Lisbon.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, niemand bezweifelt den großen Wert der Beziehungen Europas und der Vereinigten Staaten. Nur bin ich einfach der Meinung, dass Europa sicher und langfristig den Ruf eines mächtigen und real selbstständigen Mittelpunkt der Weltpolitik festigen wird, wenn sie ihre eigenen Möglichkeiten mit den russischen menschlichen, territorialen und Naturressourcen, mit dem Wirtschafts-, Kultur- und Verteidigungspotenzial Russlands vereinigen kann. Russland ist ein freundliches europäisches Land. Für unser Land, das ein Jahrhundert von Kriegskatastrophen durchgemacht hat, ist der stabile Frieden auf dem Kontinent das Hauptziel. Wie bekannt haben wir den Vertrag über das allgemeine Verbot von Atomtests, den Vertrag über die Nichtverbreitung von Kernwaffen, die Konvention über das Verbot der biologischen Waffen sowie START-II-Abkommen ratifiziert. Leider folgten nicht alle NATO-Länder unserem Beispiel. Wenn wir aber, geehrte Damen und Herren, angefangen haben, von der Sicherheit zu sprechen, müssen wir uns zuerst klar machen, von wem wir uns schützen müssen und wie.
In 2008, the third wave of NATO expansion was announced, involving Ukraine and Georgia. A shock went through the Russian government. Russia warned, "Don't do it. This is our red line." At that time, German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Nicolas Sarkozy were still able to express their concerns, cautioning that this NATO expansion was an extremely dangerous strategy. Back then, even US Ambassador in Moscow, William Burns, warned his own government that this is the reddest of all red lines for the Russians. Despite these warnings, Americans continued visiting Kiev, taking its power in Ukraine economically, politically, and military to a higher level. NATO expansion and the power of the neocons to maintain world domination are the main reasons that Russia and the West would find themselves in direct opposition. Until 2021, most of the Russian government and the Russian population has been pro-Western. President Putin, in particular, has always been Western-oriented. Some Russian conservatives, on the other hand, have accused Putin since 2014 of being naive and of not seeing the real intentions of NATO and the neocons in time, and possibly even of not stopping them.
In 2014, on Maidan Square in Kyiv, a revolution took place. In the world press, we heard about the heroic struggle of the Ukrainian people who went out on the streets and fought against a corrupt elite, and about their efforts to join the European Union. Now that Ukraine will become a real democracy, because it was a revolution of the people, it would have a hopeful and prosperous future with its well-deserved freedom. Or was it not that simple? Was there more to this revolution? And what did the concepts of freedom and democracy mean in concrete terms for the everyday life and standard of living of the average Ukrainian citizen? And what were so many prominent Americans doing in Ukraine, a country where Ukrainians and Russians have lived together for centuries, and which is Russia's backyard? What happened before?
People of Ukraine, this is your moment. This is about the future you deserve. The free world is with you. America is with you. I am with you.
The president at that time, Yanukovych, wanted neutrality for Ukraine, but was pressured by the European Union, who were of the opinion that one could not at the same time be member of the EU and the Russian Economic Union, also called the Eurasian Economic Union. But why not? Why should Ukraine not be allowed to profit as a strategic trading country between Europe and Russia? Why should Ukraine be forced to make a choice either for the West or for the East?
I have to tell you that I'm very emotional to be here together with you, with the people and the citizens who are the most brave and courageous people and citizens of the world, the Ukrainians today. Today, the European Union finally decided to put a decisive step and to start with sanctions against the regime in Ukraine.
As European representatives, Dutch and Belgian politicians Frans Timmermans, Guy Verhofstadt and Hans van Baalen were also present on Maidan Square. The European Union encouraged unstable Ukraine to make a choice between the West and Russia. With help from the West, that would be possible, he said.
The Western press emphasized the right of Ukraine to choose its own policy. They said it was their revolution for democracy and for freedom.
Well, the Western press is controlled by the United States. That's no secret, and I don't mean to sound conspiratorial. It's obvious that whenever some big event takes place, and we're waiting to see how the European newspapers react, or electronic media, there's a pause. They're waiting for signals from Washington, and then they make their editorial positions. So that's not a big secret, and it explains what you just described. But the underlying issue was, were there genuinely idealistic people who felt what our newspapers said? Of course there were.
Yeah.
A few months later, here in Belgium, there were the delegation of young people who came to talk about the upcoming elections, Europe-wide elections, and how everyone should participate, and they spoke about their experiences in their home country, Ukraine. And they believed in this, that it was democratic and it was overthrowing oligarchs and corruption.
Yeah.
I acknowledge that. Unfortunately, they were misled and they were used and abused by people who were quite cynical in power play.
American policymakers prepared the regime change in Kyiv. Yanukovych had to go, and a pro-Western government is discussed in a leaked telephone conversation between the American Victoria Nuland and Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt. In it, they discuss what the new pro-American government in Kyiv should look like.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
American Victoria Nuland was Secretary of State. She is of Eastern European descent, and since the Clinton administration, she belonged to the neoconservative group, which wanted to take an increasingly hard line toward Russia. The neocons, the abbreviated name of this group, wanted to weaken Russia. The US should maintain its global hegemony at all costs. During the Bush administration, she was an advisor on foreign policy to her mentor, Dick Cheney. She was also American ambassador to NATO at that time. In 2014, together with Joe Biden, then vice president in the Obama administration, she played the most important role in American interference in Ukraine. The coup had succeeded, and many Ukrainians were happy with their revolution. Now they would get freedom and democracy, they hoped and thought. The former president Yanukovych had been chased away, and the new pro-Western Poroshenko was in power since 2014. American politicians were openly present since the Maidan Revolution, and Ukrainians hoped that their lives would now improve. In the economic area, many lucrative contracts were being concluded for the Americans. Without the Ukrainian population realizing it, the country was being sold off and was being maneuvered in such a position that it lost a lot of control over its own future. In particular, large American investment companies such as Vanguard and BlackRock were eager to invest in Ukraine because of the country's great natural resources. Many of these raw materials are in great demand in the world due to developments in climate and sustainability. Also, the Ukrainian biochemical industry is very interesting for major global players. Ukrainian agricultural land was being bought up on a large scale, and prominent Americans were given top positions at Ukrainian organizations such as Hunter Biden, a CEO of Burisma, one of Ukraine's largest energy companies. Western media continuously reported on the need for democracy and freedom. As time goes on, and after having lost a whole generation of young men to the war, it slowly becomes clear to the Ukrainians themselves that they are just an instrument of a much larger global power game, and that democracy and freedom are merely the legitimization of this. Western economic and geopolitical interests remain underexposed. Sometimes the West clumsily reveals its real interests, however.
They're sitting on a gold mine. They're sitting on $10 to $12 trillion of critical minerals in Ukraine. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China. If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. I don't want to give that money and those assets to Putin to share with China.
In the political sphere too, the interference continues at a rapid pace. Soros, the wealthy Hungarian-American billionaire, has bought a lot of influence in Kiev with his Soros Foundation. Other projects where a lot of American interference was visible is the National Endowment for Democracy. It is the American government organization for the promotion of democracy, about which Professor Weinstein says, "Much of what we do now was 25 years ago only secretly done by the CIA." American and European politicians use the word democracy at all times. But what is democracy when the top layer is extremely rich and the bottom layer is so poor that they can barely survive? And what is democracy when many Ukrainian oligarchs sell state property to Western companies, while the Ukrainian common man hardly benefits from this?
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You have a historic opportunity to be remembered as the rada that finally and permanently laid in place the pillars of freedom that your people have longed for, yearned for so many years. All of you must put aside parochial differences and make real the revolution of dignity. The whole world is watching you. That's a fact. They're watching you because their hopes for your success. The energy sector needs to be competitive, ruled by market principles, not sweetheart deals. Corruption siphons away resources from the people, it blunts the economic growth, and it affronts the human dignity. The United States is with you in this fight. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you today. May God bless our two great nations, and may God protect our troops. Thank you.
And what is a revolution of dignity when Joe Biden accuses Russia of corruption and he himself offers family members opportunities for high Ukrainian positions, including his own son, Hunter Biden. This son became one of the co-directors of Ukraine's largest energy company, Burisma. The story of Hunter Biden's laptop dates from this period. When Ukrainian prosecutor Shogin investigates the corruption, his father, then Vice President Joe Biden, demands the immediate dismissal of the prosecutor and thus an end of the investigation into his son. Otherwise, Ukraine can forget about an already promised amount of $1 billion.
I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired.
Hunter Biden, your son, was getting paid a lot of money to serve on the board of a Ukrainian energy company. What's your understanding of what your son was doing for an extraordinary amount of money?
I don't know what he was doing. I know he was on the board. I found out he was on the board after he was on the board, and that was it. And there's nobody...
Well, you've had a lot of time. Isn't this something you want to get to the bottom of?
No, because I trust my son.
But that doesn't pass the smell test. Like, when you're vice president, isn't there a higher standard? Don't you need to know what's happening with your family? Don't you need to put down some guardrails?
Unless there was something that was... there was something on its face that was wrong. There's nothing on its face that was wrong. So look, if you want to talk about problems, let's talk about Trump's family.
So you think that everything that happened was kosher?
You know there's not one single bit of evidence. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired.
In the West, the media consistently talked about the aggressor Russia. This was repeated year in, year out, and was embedded in our brains. Putin's Russia was supposed to have expansionist intentions and wanted to annex Ukraine, the Baltic states, and other parts of Europe. Fear was constantly being spread, although there was no evidence to be found. Russians, on the other hand, saw NATO as expansionist. The promise that NATO had made in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, not to expand 1 inch further into Eastern Europe, turned out to be worthless. In 2014, Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham promised in Kyiv that Ukrainian soldiers would be trained by NATO and that military equipment would be supplied.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
Рік 2017 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
Our fight is not with the Russian people but with Putin.
Ми боремося не з російським народом, але з Путіним.
Our promise to you is to take your cause to Washington.
Наша обіцянка – це те, що ми вашу боротьбу доведемо до Вашингтона.
Inform the American people of your bravery.
Проінформуємо американський народ про вашу відважність.
And make the case against Putin to the world.
І покажемо про докази проти Путіна усьому світу.
In the Netherlands and other NATO member states, hardly any mention was made of these plans, which shows the dominant status of the US within NATO. It is particularly surprising that Europe silently watches the actions of the US on the European continent. The question, what rights do the US actually think it has on European territory, is never asked. In February 2024, the New York Times published an article and map showing that the CIA has been running a large network of CIA spy bases on the Russian border in Ukraine since 2016. For 6 years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a NATO-affiliated organization has been operating directly on Russia's border, a situation that Russia had been objecting to since 1990, and it was promised repeatedly by the West, both verbally and in writing, that this would not happen. In the US, the American neoconservatives gained the upper hand in foreign policy. Meanwhile, NATO exercises were increased along the Baltic Russian and Polish Russian borders. In Ukraine itself, there was no urge to become a NATO member until 2014. Only a small percentage of the Ukrainians were in favor of it. This is shown by every opinion poll between 1991 and 2014. The 2011 NATO report states, NATO membership is not widely supported in the country, with some polls suggesting that popular support for it is less than 20%. The solution was found in 2014 in pushing the democratic revolution. After the regime change, the US openly spoke of having a substantial influence on the new Kyiv government. Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin complained that since 2014, the most shocking thing is that all government appointments have been made in agreement with the US. In December 2024, a month before leaving office, and contrary to his consistent statements, President Biden, despite multiple charges, grants his son a full and unconditional pardon.
Western experts with different opinions were deliberately kept out of the mainstream media. The American economist Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who also guided the complicated transition from the communist system to the free market in the 1990s, and Professor John Mersheimer warn against the reckless policy of the United States. Military analyst Colonel McGregor also states that the conflict could have been avoided if NATO had respected the Russians' security wish. The Western world was being seduced with the idea that Ukraine can decide for itself whether it wants to join NATO.
You have to be very careful in terms of choosing your foreign policy. Do you think any country in the Western Hemisphere has the right to choose its own foreign policy, even if the United States doesn't like what it's doing? Do you think that we thought that Cuba had the right to invite the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba in 1962? If Mexico or Canada 10 years from now decide that they want to invite China to build a military base on their territory, do you think the United States is going to say, no problem, we don't care whether China builds a military base in Mexico or Canada, I can guarantee you the United States will go ballistic if China tries to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. The United States has a Monroe Doctrine, which says that the Western Hemisphere is our backyard. Well, the same basic logic applies to the Russians. The Russians had no interest in conquering Ukraine before 2014, when the crisis first broke out, February 2014. The Russians had no interest in conquering Ukraine. Michael McFaul, who was the American ambassador to Moscow at the time, and is a major league critic of Putin, has said publicly that the Russians had no interest in conquering Ukraine, conquering Crimea before 2014.
The United States security figures started to tell themselves that the U.S. is the unipolar power. It's the sole superpower. It's the indispensable country. It's the world's leader. It can do what it wants. And definitely, this is the philosophy of the neoconservatives. And that started with Richard Cheney, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense in 1992. It has been part and parcel of every single administration. Neoconservative means the U.S. belief that it runs the world. That's it. Biden, who's an old man and lives in the past, says all the time, the U.S., hey man, that's the most powerful country, not in the world, but in world history.
At the same time. We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world. History of the world. The history of the world.
So Biden's idea is, yeah, we're so powerful, compromise with Russia? No way. And so we have had proposals by Russia, don't expand NATO. This has been the core of the issue. Don't leave the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Don't overthrow governments in our region. Abide by the Minsk agreements to give autonomy to the Donbass or eastern Ukraine. Make a new security arrangement with the U.S. not based on NATO enlargement. Don't put your missiles near our borders. All of these proposals have been rejected by the United States, usually with the back of the hand, not even sitting down to negotiate them. And this is extremely dangerous. Putting NATO right next to Russia is a recipe for World War III. So we should keep a space between the U.S. and Russia. They are two ambitious, proud, nuclear superpowers. They don't need to have their militaries up against each other.
Immediately after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, with the pro-Western government, Ukraine seemed to be heading toward a civil war. In Crimea, where the majority is Russian, people wanted the protection of Russia and to join Russia. An overwhelming majority voted for joining Russia. The Western media spoke of annexation, and Hillary Clinton compared Putin to Hitler, something which deeply touched the Russians. From a Russian perspective, the situation was the same as when East Germany was reunited with West Germany. The Russian naval port of Sevastopol in Crimea has been for centuries the most important strategic and military port of the Russian Navy on the Black Sea. Although Crimea may have been Ukrainian territory for 20 years, the Russian fleet in Sevastopol was very important to Russia. The prospect of Russia losing this vital port due to Ukrainians' NATO membership was unthinkable and non-negotiable for the Russian political and military elite.
Well, from the very beginning, I would say the Russians have exercised extraordinary restraint in Ukraine because they never wanted to destroy the place, and they certainly didn't want to kill millions of Ukrainians. So that's not a real surprise. Their interest in what's happening in Ukraine is very different from ours. They're not interested in destroying us or Ukraine. They simply want to remove the danger that Ukraine could be used as a platform for attack against them. That's all. We took the same position regarding Cuba. We didn't want to murder people in Cuba. We didn't want to kill millions of Cubans. We simply did not want Cuba to be a platform for attack against us using Russian missiles and warheads. That's all. Very straightforward. There's no mystery here. Everyone tries to impart a spin to this to try and make it look more sinister than it is. It's a very straightforward matter.
In this regard, we have made it absolutely clear that NATO's expansion to the east is unacceptable. What's not clear about it? We are not the ones that deploy missiles next to the United States borders. That's the other way around. The United States brought their missiles next to our borders. They are at our threshold. Are we excessive in our demands not to put any more offensive weapons next to our home? What's so unusual about this request?
For Russia now, there was not only the inconvenience that Ukraine would end up in the Western sphere of influence from 2014 onwards, but also the unacceptable consequence that NATO would be able to build missile installations on the western side of its empire. So with Ukraine as a NATO member, there would be two direct threats to Russian national security.
Could it be said that if the regime change in Kiev didn't happen, that Crimea still would be part of the Ukraine?
It's a very important question because it is directly asking is Putin an aggressive expansionist leader? Is he a following romantic nationalism? And the answer is flatly no. There would not have been a Russian absorption of Crimea. However, many good reasons Russia would have had there been no coup d'etat in Kiev. But the coup d'etat in Kiev exposed a very serious security risk to Russia. Let us remember that Russia's most important naval base in Sevastopol was on a lease. And all it would take would be for the Ukrainians to revoke that lease, for Russia to face the fact of its most important naval base being occupied by the American Navy, which would be a very serious security threat to the Russian Federation. So that fact, that risk, that danger is what made the Russians move in Crimea. There was not any earlier plans to take back the Crimea, which Khrushchev gave to Ukraine illegally, one might say, in, I think it was 1954 55.
But why did the Western press not cover more about this great geopolitical power play? It would have been to give more understanding for a European or an American citizen to hear the other side of the story.
Well, as we know today, the last thing they want is to hear the other side of the story. The other side of the story is, by definition, disinformation and propaganda. And by calling it that, and only today, allowing reporters to give the Kiev version of every event that happens, they are intentionally depriving the public of anything resembling debate and discussion of issues that are of vital importance if we're not going to have a world war.
Russian speakers in the Donbass, like the Crimeans, also foresaw major problems because they would be ruled by a pro-Western or pro-American government in Kiev. Eastern Ukrainians felt a connection with the Russian mentality, language, religion and history. The new Western Ukrainian President Poroshenko prescribed, with the help of violence, the new laws and used cluster bombs in eastern Ukraine. Since 2014, more than 14,000 people have died in the Donbass region. From the Russian perspective, the war, therefore, did not start in the year 2022, but in 2014, immediately after the Maidan Revolution. The Western media paid almost no attention to this civil war. The Russians saw horrific images on television from 2014 onwards of Russians and Eastern Ukrainians being killed by their own Kiev government. Russians wondered why the West paid so little attention to this drama.
We saw the situation when a large part of Ukraine, especially the eastern part and southern part, namely Donetsk region, Lugansk region, they didn't accept it. They were not ready, and just to agree to this ultra-nationalistic approach, ultra-nationalistic policy of those who seized the power, because the Russian language was banned, practically banned, and just they spoke Russian, they thought Russian in Russian, and immediately it was just the way that they couldn't use this language, and that certainly culminated into a practically civil war. It was a classical internal conflict between the Donetsk, Lugansk region and the Kiev authorities, who proclaimed a counter-terrorist operation, and that was just a kind of an operation when they deliberately destroyed the population of these two regions. Many people in the West believe that the war started in 2022, but civil war in Ukraine, as I have already mentioned, started in 2014. So for 8 years, Ukrainian side was deliberately destroying Donetsk and Lugansk and killing civil innocent population. There is a figure that I think is not known in the West, that 5,500 civilians were killed just between 2014 and 2022.
That was effectively a civil war. A small arms fire, artillery fire, over time, killing civilians. The start of the Kiev government's response to the plans of leaving Ukraine, announced by leaders in Donbass, was to use tanks and jet aircraft to bomb and to strike with artillery civilians. And these deaths and these murders were felt very widely within the Russian Federation. In the West, this was ignored because, well, it's the legitimate power of Kiev over its territory, and so they looked the other way.
Russians demanded that President Putin would protect the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine. As a result of this, the Russian parliament gave permission to annex the Donbas as well. But Putin didn't want so, because firstly, he knew that the West would not tolerate this, and secondly, he still thought that the West would cooperate in peace agreements between Western and Eastern Ukrainians. From then on, Putin was accused by his own government of being too naive. In addition, Putin believed Angela Merkel and François Hollande when they jointly were striving a ceasefire between Eastern and Western Ukrainians. These are the so-called Minsk Agreements and were signed by all parties in 2015. In 2022, however, the Russians learned with dismay about Merkel's interview in which she stated that the plan in 2015 had been to train Ukrainian soldiers and make Ukraine a de facto NATO member state, even though it was not a NATO member in the official sense. Merkel said that the attempt to create calm in the Donbas in reality was not possible. We wanted to gain time to supply and train the Kiev government and army.
When they failed to achieve immediate victory in 2016, then they agreed to sign so-called Minsk agreements. And this was just very simple agreements, and if they were fulfilled, if they were implemented, now I believe Lugansk and Donetsk would have existed within the Ukrainian state peacefully and without great problems. And these agreements were as such, so just withdrawal of all troops, of heavy troops, adoption of the Russian language as the second official language, and constitutional reforms that granted autonomy to Donetsk and Lugansk. Basically, these were just the main elements of these agreements. But Kiev signed it, and it was not only Kiev, but France and Germany also. But they will never prepare to implement it. And you know, just that recently it was rather cynically when Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Hollande, former president of France, admitted that they were not going to implement Minsk agreements, and also former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, also said so. That was only a time-gaining exercise. They need time to build up their military machine, to create strong fortifications that we have now to overcome, And that was just a kind of a very, very dirty political game.
Toen zijn Merkel en Hollande zelf naar Minsk gevlogen en weer de vertegenwoordigers van die andere partijen er ook bij. En toen is Minsk 2 gesloten. En dat toen eerst Poroshenko, later Merkel en vervolgens bevestigd door Hollande hebben gezegd. Die akkoorden waren eigenlijk nooit oprecht gemeend. Wat ons betreft was het alleen om Oekraïne de tijd te geven een groter leger op te bouwen.
The relationship between Russia and the United States was getting worse rapidly. In 2016, anti-Russia news in the West is increasing concerning the so-called Russian interference in the American presidential election of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the barbaric actions of the Russians in the war in Syria, the Russian poisoning of Skripal, the hero status of Navalny, Putin's expansionist plans, and on the concept of democracy versus autocracy. Most information was presented without any facts, and the propaganda war between Russia and the West took on dangerous forms. In the meantime, Ukrainian President Poroshenko had not fulfilled his promise to establish peace between East and West Ukrainians. Moreover, the divided and torn country was not better off than in the year 2014, as had been promised on the Maidan Square. In 2019, the disappointed Ukrainian population again elected a new president, Vladimir, now Volodymyr, Zelensky. The new President Zelensky promised peace between East and West Ukrainians. He had no experience in politics and soon had to deal with the power of the Ukrainian oligarchs and the ultra-nationalists. In 2019, Ukraine was the most corrupt country in Europe and the population was torn between East and West. The Ukrainians were divided and there was a large gap between the rich and the poor. The Wolfowitz Doctrine and the policy of the American neoconservatives had gained a lot of power with the Western Ukrainian elite and the nationalists in the Kiev government. NATO continued to spread the double message. Ukraine is promised NATO membership, and then NATO says that they don't want to do that. In December 2021, Russia asked for clarity from the Zelensky government and NATO regarding their desire for a neutral Ukraine and a NATO membership or not. Neither the United States nor NATO provided any clarity.
We are not the ones who are threatening someone. We are not the ones who came to the border of the US or the UK. They came to us. We have made it absolutely clear that NATO's expansion to the east is unacceptable. We ask you not to do it, and you promised us that you won't do it. We ask you not to do it, and you promised us that you won't do it. We ask you not to do it, and you promised us that you won't do it. Every year we try to talk. We are not the ones that deploy missiles next to the United States borders. That's the other way around. The United States brought their missiles next to our borders. They are at our threshold. Are we excessive in our demands not to put any more offensive weapons next to our home? Are we excessive in our demands not to put any more offensive weapons next to our home?
Russia did its best to avoid this confrontation. By the end of 2021, we proposed to the United States and to NATO to conclude kind of arrangements that guaranteed the security of both sides. And our foreign ministry presented a draft text of this agreement. Our senior diplomats went to Western capitals to discuss them. All this was just put aside.
On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The Western world was informed that there was only one aggressor. Russia had invaded Ukraine. The questions why it all happened were ignored, and all the background information was missing in the Western narrative.
So help me God. So help me God. Congratulations, Mr. President.
On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump was inaugurated as the new President of the United States. During his campaign, he promised to quickly end the war in Ukraine. After the many broken promises of the West, it would, however, be the language of mutual respect that could be the opening to a solution of this conflict. Language based on harmony instead of hegemony. Whether Trump speaks this language remains to be seen.